All right. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Okay. Excuse me. I'd like to kick off today's Tech Talk by introducing my friend and colleague, Professor Deb West, the Pro Vice Chancellor for Learning and Teaching Innovation at Flinders University. Dr. West is a senior university administrator who is responsible for teaching and learning solutions. Deb, as well, is a researcher, and the thing that's always drawn me to her work is that she's very interested in identifying practical solutions that will work, programs that will be used, and thinking through what are the underlying needs behind learning analytics and the kind of analytics dashboards that are built. So not as interested in the robustness of the algorithms that are developed, in as much are we developing those algorithms to solve the right problems in the first place, right? A preliminary question. And so I think in that way, Deb provides a very unique and helpful perspective to us at ACT as we roll out and develop learning and navigation solutions to complement our work and measurement, that we ensure that we're developing our solutions around the right problems that would be needed and would be used. Deb, as a researcher as well as an academic administrator, has responsibility for those solutions, so wants to make sure that they are things that will be used, that are reasonable, and that are needed. And so to do that, she has done a variety, and in my mind, kind of some of the largest scale studies to identify user preferences, behaviors, both of faculty, administrators, and today she'll be speaking about some really groundbreaking work that she and a team of other researchers have done around identifying and understanding the perspectives of students around learning analytics. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. West.
Thank you. We were joking that I have a lovely accessory here in the form of a sling that's perfect for putting the microphone. So I had a plan in my method of my madness of not looking where I was going and tripping over and breaking my arm a week ago. It's probably a good thing I'm anchored here, because usually I would walk and talk, but that might not be a good thing today. But thank you all for inviting me. It's great to actually be here. And I think as John, great introduction, thank you, John. As he indicated, we've worked together and for quite a number of years now, and have some very similar interests in how we can translate some of the work and fantastic work that's going on around scientific and algorithmic development, which quite honestly is miles ahead in that space compared to the thinking that we've done around the ethics that are involved in that, the thinking that we've done around the translation of that into education and understanding the kinds of needs for that. So it's fantastic that we have such great development, but I am really interested in how in my role, how do I engage to make sure that this stuff is being used by academics, by students, that it's providing the right information. I mean, I think that's part of the reason why people would use it. But there's more to it than that. And so this kind of what I'll talk about today is based on a number of studies that actually done. Oh, there's Flinders. That's obviously where I'm from. That's our main building. That's our student hub. And by way of kind of introduction of that, one of our overriding things, everything that we do is to us underpinned and measured by student success. So that's the very clear strategic direction that we have. So that's always the kind of question that we're asking. What does this mean for students? Always driven by that. We'll skip that one. I'm going to refer to 3 different studies. The first one was actually completed in 2015, although published in 2016. But it was with a consortium, a group of researchers. Essentially, the Australian government decided that they wanted to do some investigation into how learning analytics was being used or could be used to support student retention. A very clear focus on student retention. And there was some money, and they basically commissioned 2 projects in Australia. And I led one of those projects. Some of you might be familiar with Shane Dawson. He's a colleague of mine. You might know his name. He led the other project. So we had 2 that were running quite in parallel. In terms of the one I was looking at and running, Essentially, we ended up calling it Let's Talk Learning Analytics, but these were the key kind of drivers that we had for that. That was what we had to kind of achieve in that space. In order to do that, we had an institutional level survey where we talked to senior academics, got an understanding of the infrastructure that was in place. We then had a survey of teaching academics that were involved in this, asking them about learning analytics, what kinds of things they thought would be useful to them, what kind of information would be useful. And we did a range of interviews to follow up on. The second study actually replicated the first one, but did it in Malaysia. So what we were looking at is taking that academic, the institutional level and academic level survey, replicating those in Malaysia, along with a group of 5 Malaysian universities. Let me see. I'm putting this up there because the IRU is the Innovative Research Universities Group. So within Australia, we kind of have some groupings of universities. The University, Flinders, is part of the Innovative Research Universities Group. The university where I previously worked, Charles Darwin University, which is right up in the north, are also part of the IRU. So the IRU said, well, actually, we want to take this a step further. We want to understand what teaching academics, what they actually think about learning analytics in terms of how it can be used for teaching practice, really focusing on that as opposed to just retention. So the first study had the focus on retention because it was government driven. This was driven by this group of universities saying, well, actually, we want to understand the teaching practice. So here again, these were our key outcomes that we had in terms of being able to do this work and to understand that, thinking about some different metrics for effectiveness to improve teaching. And I'll give you some of the findings on these in a minute. But essentially, we did that in 3 stages. We had the surveys that we duplicated. We conducted another set of focus groups to explore the requirements and some of the views. And we also wanted to understand how people wanted that data presented to them. So we had a conversation earlier in some meetings about the complex nature of data that we might want to present. So we were really interested in hearing from academics how they wanted that presented to them. That's all fantastic. So we had that set around institutional senior views, academic senior views. Then we had the teaching academic views. The obvious piece that's missing in that is students. So we actually then wanted to find out what students thought about learning analytics, the kinds of things that they wanted done. So again, a group of us some of whom had worked on the first, there's only actually 2 people up there, that myself and Bill Searle were the only 2 that were on, and Danny, 3 of us that were on the first project. But most of these were on the second project, and then we carried over into the student facing. We were building on those earlier projects. So we were actually looking at what are the kinds of things that senior academics and teaching academics said they thought would be useful. In terms of gathering data from students, we then wanted to ask the students, did they think that that was helpful? There's a whole kind of underpinning piece here that we tend to be quite paternalistic about our students. There's a power imbalance. We tend to assume we know what's best, which often isn't necessarily the case, but we wanted to test that. So what did they think about it all? So in terms of what that one was actually about, it was just exploring those understandings, testing some of those things, but also testing the concerns that they might have. So how'd they feel about this stuff? Do they have any concerns? We had asked academics about anything that they had concern about, and then we were testing some of these with students, but we were also delving into the literature and seeing what was out there in terms of applications of learning analytics and concerns of learning analytics to kind of test that. So I'm just going to give you a bit of the headline findings from those studies. Yep. Essentially in the first study, we really are at, keeping in mind the data collection on this was late 2014, early 2015. We're at an early stage of development and implementation and understanding around learning analytics. Now, even though that was 2014, 2015, I'm fairly confident I can still say the same things. So things haven't progressed an awful lot since that time. We've progressed in some ways, and I think the data science side of things has progressed probably more than the other areas. So even though we've made some really good progress, we really haven't at scale been able to implement this stuff. It's still very much in pockets. Even where we have those reports that are targeted, they're not well utilized. People don't necessarily take them up. The other thing I just point out is that there's certainly layers of maturity around learning analytics and the way that this is thought about. So, for example, we can talk about it in technical terms and what that means around integrations and what does that look like. We're probably more sophisticated in that space. But our conceptual thinking is related to learning and teaching. So how far advanced are we on making those connections between learning and teaching and the conceptual frameworks? There's also maturity in the actual use of those and the actions that we take from that data. And I think in terms of even the way that we use educational technology, if we're not using the ed tech, then it's really difficult to get the data. And so there's certainly, we're still at an early stage of development. The second thing is that context is really, really important here. Now, I say that in a number of ways. If you think about context in terms of institutions and different organizations, we have different drivers that are in place. You think about the infrastructure, it varies considerably. One of the places, as John said, where I used to work and when we first met, we had a very strong agenda around learning analytics. The reason for that is because 70% of our student load was online. So in order to get cues from students, we had to rely on that technology. So that was our context. When we were undertaking, and when I've moved to Flinders, the load is very different. So there's less of a driver. I can't rely on that to leverage it. So it's actually a totally different context. When we asked students about their use and how they use the LMS, we found that it varied really considerably. And some of that's related to the way that the institution does teaching, whether it's face-to-face, fully online, blended. But it's also about that translation into different disciplines and how that might look in that space. We had some institutions that are about half of the topics or courses, I think is the language that you use here, but the courses were online, and in other cases it was barely anything. And that really came to the kind of forefront, particularly in Malaysia, and how they referred to different things. So there's an international caution here as well around that. There's a lot of variability across the sector in relation to the preparedness, how institutions are thinking about and implementing. And I think it's really important to highlight the variability. It's really hard to say the sector is at this stage. And again, we've had some conversation this morning that around even the K-12 as a sector. Again, you could say that it's a lot of variation in there. There's a lot of variation in higher ed. There's also a lot of tension between the extent to which learning analytics can drive behaviors or, in fact, take the functions of people. So people were really worried about what this was going to do to my job, but they were also worried about machine algorithms making decisions. And so there is a tension in that we have to be quite conscious about. There's also a tension between what people want and the costs involved and some of the limitations versus academic freedom. Now, you think we were talking to senior academic staff. Some of the drivers for people in my kind of role are about funding and performance measures and all of that stuff. It's not necessarily what the academic teaching physics is interested in. In fact, I can guarantee you it generally isn't. So the idea that there is that tension. So what I might want to do as a senior administrator is to bring in certain things, but getting my academics on board is another challenge. And the people, a wide range of roles need to be involved in this. And one of the things is we asked about where learning analytics actually sat within institutions. So where was it aligned from a management point of view? And the ones, it was either in an IT area or an academic area. It was more often in an IT area, which in my view is quite problematic because it's very hard to engage the academics, and I feel it needs to be actually driven by an educational viewpoint. So I'm very fortunate that I have carriage of it in an academic role to be able to drive some of that. So although the surveys that took place in Malaysia were later than that, the same themes were all the same. So that still came through, very, very similar. When we asked generally the kinds of things that academics wanted or were interested in, the key kind of things that came up were about these. But I'll just make the point that even though this is coming from the survey findings from a number of years ago, I've run workshops in a whole range of institutions as consultant, gone in, done this. These themes really hold very true. So what are academics actually looking for? Out of the kind of people, and we're a couple of hundred academics that responded in the first instance, but I'll show you the Malaysian stuff in a minute as well. And they came from different things. The key themes that are emerging related to the application or use cases. So even though we were asking them about what kind of data would be helpful, they actually put it in language around use cases, which I think is just a little lesson for us in that sense. What they were talking about was improving curriculum and the course design, improving the retention and performance, and the resources and planning. And in that sense, the ones that talked about sources of data were student behaviors, academic actions and behaviors, and demographics. And then you can see that sometimes they got talked about as both student performance could sit in a couple of categories. The academic behaviors and actions, it's not really the academics who want to know about the academic behaviors and actions, particularly keeping in mind this is coming from a study that was talking to senior administrators, teaching academics, but other people as well. So academics who might not be teaching. So I'll raise that again in a minute. Obviously, these things are linked. We started to unpack it, and we wanted to know a little bit about how, sorry, my slides are. So when we started to unpack some of that stuff, and these are, I'm not going to go through these, I just want to give you a sense of what these things were about in terms of the student behavior, what kinds of things that they were asking about. If you look at those, you'll see, and as I go through some of the other ones, you'll see, just reference my earlier comment that the level of thinking is reflected in the different types of questions and the sophistication and understanding about learning analytics and what it can do. So you'll get more sophisticated questions from people who are much more immersed and other questions that are really quite basic, but that's okay. And the kind of point I would make with this is I often hear a dialogue that talks about basic reports and that they're not very helpful. Well, maybe from a data science point of view, it's not a sophisticated report. And that would be, I've literally had arguments with my data science people saying, I need you to build these reports. And they're like, do that in my sleep. I'm like, great, do it in your sleep, I don't care. I need it though, because this is what my academics are asking for. And so I think that there is this kind of level of sophistication of thinking, and we need to go with what people say are helpful to them. Obviously, we need to test if this is valid and everything else. But at the end of the day, if people say they want that report, even though it's not terribly sophisticated, we still do it. These are the kinds of things around the course curriculum side of things. Again, that kind of sense of it coming through, but what they will actually think about in that. Holding very true, irrespective of the conversations in different institutions and in different countries. That these are still the kinds of things that are coming through with that. And improving student performance. One of the things that's actually shifted a little bit in the last few years is the discussion of retention. So our government, as I indicated, very big about retention. They're still big about retention. But in this sector, we've actually started to shift it much more to student success. So we don't want to talk about retention so much anymore. And then done some work around what does student success mean to students, because we want it to be by their definition as opposed to the actual our definition and what we're funded by. So some key messages from academics. They want something that's going to make their life easier, but they don't have a lot of time to contribute. At the same time, they think that they feel that they're very unique in their discipline, and that things need to be personalized. And they do want to know what's going on. Now this presents on the surface, okay, but there's a few challenges in that. So we know we need academic input. Academics don't have a lot of time. We know we need some consistency in design, but they are saying it's all, I need to be able to do my own thing. There is a whole, in Australia at the moment anyway, a whole tension going on around academic freedom. And so, and how that translates. So just kind of keep that in your heads a little bit for the moment. So in our IRU, moving on to the second study and some of the findings there, we ran some focus groups to find out what questions they wanted answered and what they would find useful, and to gather some feedback. So the questions that they said basically fell into the same sort of themes, but it was essentially grouped a little bit different. And one thing that kind of came through to us, that there was a grouping around classroom analytics, and then there was a grouping around student success. So thinking about those two things, so some is the kind of stuff that's going on in the learning, as opposed to the output of learning and the success and the progression of learning. So there's a bit of a nuance, kind of that. So these, again, I'm just giving you a sample of some of these kinds of things that people were asking. Keeping in mind in Malaysia, this is coming out of the data sets coming out of Malaysia, the use of technology in education is different. There's not a lot of use of fully online, and the use of learning management systems and other technology is quite different. It was it took me quite a while to kind of translate some of this, but they actually refer to the use of an LMS in the classroom. They refer to that as a MOOC. So they actually kept talking about these MOOCs, and I was like, okay, show me your MOOC. And it was actually what they were talking about was just a blended for a course. So it's a just interesting dialogue. So thinking about, again, the maturity levels, so they were talking access metrics, they were talking about time measurements, and how they were thinking about that. Then we had some engagement metrics. And I think these ones are probably a bit more interesting in my sense. And then we had academic and grade performance. So thinking about some of that, and some of that might be relevant as well in terms of within your context around that assessment piece. But again, understanding of the educational piece, keeping in mind that, teaching academics aren't necessarily trained in teaching. They're expected to teach, but they don't have the same kind of formal training around teaching. So there's that piece going on. And then there's an understanding of learning analytics and a maturity around learning analytics and what it can potentially do is also playing into the kinds of questions and thinking about how they're asking those. So there is that relationship. And I think higher order thinking in terms of the complexity of the questions is a development that can be expected as understanding increases. So again, just going back to that context and thinking about when you're engaging and how you're disseminating with different institutions, thinking about that institutional context, levels of maturity around that thinking, particularly in relation to the educational tech piece and the use of learning analytics. We also did some work in terms of unpacking the questions and looking at the data points that underpin them. And just highlight a couple of things. We used a framework that some of you might be familiar with, a community of inquiry model. Essentially, it has kind of 3 domains. It's a very well tested model. And the 3 domains are around cognitive engagement, social engagement, and teacher engagement. When we unpacked the questions, pulled out the data points, and mapped it, what we found was that in Australia, the academics were focused on the cognitive presence. So it was very much about how the student was engaging with that learning within a focus of attention. As opposed to in Malaysia, it was about social presence, which actually, if you reflect on that, makes a lot of sense because there's a cultural piece that's going with this, but it wasn't inherently obvious to us at the time. And then nobody was interested in teacher presence, irrespective of where they lived. They didn't care. Very few of them wanted to know how what they did had an impact. Now, that's a whole other challenge for us. So some key messages out of that came through that study. Not a lot have changed, particularly since we'd done the first thing. There was a lot of consistency between here and Malaysia, or Australia and Malaysia. We had an underutilization of reports. There's certainly a relationship between the report value and the role of people. So thinking about whether I'm a course coordinator or I'm teaching into a course or I'm a dean of education, different reports have different value to me. And it's also at different points in time and in the curriculum. If they can't see the relevance and you can't make the connection, then they're probably not going to use it. So we actually need to kind of have that. There's also a connection between the pedagogical approach and the different kinds of reports. So I think the highlight of that is different value at different points in time for different people, depending on the pedagogical approach. And we need to do some of that work to actually understand that. So far I've kind of focused on that academic and institutional view. I'm going to move to the student view now. Very few studies have actually been done asking students about their perspectives. There's a few that are around, but they are relatively small scale. A lot of the ones that have been done are focus groups, maybe 40 students. We actually had over 2,000 students who responded in this survey, plus focus groups that we ran across 6 institutions. But the idea that we hadn't really engaged with students around this stuff raises a whole bunch of issues. Some of them are ethical, related to what we should and shouldn't be doing. Some of them, informed consent, that kind of thing. Efficacy, but again, if we're going to engage them, they've got to be relevant to those people. So that was what we set out to do. Again, this was funded by the Innovative Research Universities group. They were quite keen on that. That was essentially, right. We had, I'm going to just back it up here a second. I want to see if yeah, there we go. I'm going to skip a slide, sorry. In that methodology, basically we had the 2 phases. So we did the lit review, obviously. We developed the survey, we did some initial focus groups, but in that, keep in mind that we're building off the previous 2 studies. So we're asking students about the things that academics said that they thought was really important and the things that they wanted to do. We want to test that with students, also bringing in some things around what was in the literature, what could be useful in that sense. So then we had some follow-up focus groups because we wanted to understand what was going on in that. So essentially, these were the kinds of things that we were asking the students in a series of, basically we had a whole series of Likert scores. I'll talk about some of the comfort levels stuff in a minute. And understanding their concern. The survey was sent to all undergrad and postgrad coursework students in 6 IRU institutions. While we have what we think, is a decent sized sample, it was a disappointing response rate. It was 1% out of all the students, which, I'm not quite sure how to take that in the sense of going, Was it a lack of interest, or was it a lack of understanding, or what was it? We actually did some follow-up work. We're still not sure what that is. Interestingly, we actually had a big debate because the Analytica scandal had just hit at the time we were about to send out the survey. And we had a big debate about whether we should actually be sending this survey at this point in time, how it was going to influence it. Clearly, it didn't jog anybody into doing the survey, I don't think. Which we kind of thought, well, maybe people be really passionate about it because of the timing. But it is important just to note that that was going on at the time. We looked at our the demographics of the survey coming back compared to our IRU population that it went out to. It's very similar. There's a little difference in the gender. We clearly had a bit of a difference there, but not very much. And I will make the statement now that when we looked at all of the findings, we did some splits around demographics. We were looking at it in different ways. There was very little difference. The only group was in one small area, was around international students. Everything else was consistent across the board. All right, to the more interesting stuff. So I acknowledge the fact that this is hard to read, but people can read it online. I mean, the slides will be available, all of that. I'm just going to draw your attention to a few of the things. So basically that the slide is related to the type of data that students think we collect. And I must say, they give us a lot of credit, and oh, really, we don't do that at all. But they think that we're a bit more ambitious than we are. The red is the data points that they think that we collect. But less students thought that we were collecting data relating to mobile phone location data, access to university employment services, university social media sites and groups, and the mobile app. Now, some of those were a bit surprising to me, particularly the university mobile app, because we all push the mobile app, and it is a university mobile app. So why they think that data isn't actually being collected by that, it was just a bit odd. So that's essentially, in some of them, they did give us a bit too much credit. We then asked them about their comfort level, now this is comfort level regarding the use of the various data types. So if we had collected, we said, if we did have this data, how comfortable would you be in us using it? Now, I'm just, again, going to draw your attention to where those drops are. Demographic data is the first drop. Access to employment services, location data, social media usage, university mobile app, and wireless network device. So EduRoam, university Wi-Fi, that kind of stuff. They're less comfortable with us using that data. Now, one of the interesting challenges we have in there is that, of course, we have to collect demographic data. We have no choice about that. We have to report it to government. But we don't have to use it in our learning analytics. And I think that's the kind of key point in that, having a good think about that. We then were asking them about how useful they thought that the kinds of information and reports. So keeping in mind, academics had said that they think that it would be really good if students had this kind of dashboard. We wanted to test that and ask them if they actually thought it would be useful to them. The ones that they thought would be more useful are the ones where it's about additional learning resources to help them on the basis of grades. So if we could provide them with that information, you've got a credit, you've got a fail, you're sitting, this is how you're sitting. If you were to access these learning resources, this would be most useful. And information about services that could support them related to their learning. So less about the personal stuff, more about the learning side of it. They actually thought it would be less useful to be told about changing their study behavior. And that's an interesting one, because academics actually said, we really think that we should tell students how to change their behavior. And students said, please don't tell me how to change my behavior. Tell me about the resources I can access that will help me with that. So some of it is about messaging. Some is about positioning and thinking about some of that. They are kind of less happy about comparing grades. So their grades compared to others in their class, they're not as happy about that piece. We also wanted to consider the level of concern, so the ethical pieces around that. And this is, the red is where they basically have no concern. And the blue shows where there's all other levels of concern. So you can see a few are standing out here, and the two that are mainly standing out closest to me are around the security of the data and the data being shared with third parties. Now that's unsurprising, really. I mean, that's particularly, again, just reference the timing of ours with the Analytica thing coming out. So very unsurprising in that, and very similar to the concerns that the academics held. So the kinds of things that academics, that was in their top ones around concerns as well. In the mid-range, however, students had some concern related to their data being used to trigger support services to contact them. Now that is kind of an interesting one, because that's one of the ones where we think in a retention space, if this data could be given to professional staff member or academic staff member that could then reach out to the students, that's one of the things that we thought would be useful. Students are not as comfortable with that. They're also not as comfortable for being used for academic research, which is, again, one of the things that academics particularly want to do. We then ran some focus groups to try and understand what was going on with that. There was a lot in the literature about the fact that perhaps students didn't understand the terms being used, so we wanted to unpack that. We tested that a little bit. The key things that came through, though, were related to informed consent, power and choice, connection between data collection and how it's going to be used, and what we referred to as a personal professional line. So from a student point of view, the professional, they are a student within our context. That's their professional role. When you start drifting into some of the other things that we're asking, they see that as crossing a personal line. And that particularly came out around mobile data, location data, that side of things. They were very worried about being profiled in relation to the demographic piece. So that was really a big concern for them. And they didn't want to feel like Big Brother was watching that. They really didn't feel that there was a transparency around what was being collected, how it was being used, and for what purpose. So that kind of came through very clearly, that they wanted some more information on that. They also wanted choices to turn dashboards on and off, to be able to be reminded that the data is being collected about them. Now, I just want to, excuse me, useful to look at some of these things in terms of the academic side by side with the student response. So we can see that, I think, as we all do as people, academics were tending to look at the application of learning analytics through their own lens, what was helpful to them. Institutional leaders were looking at it through their own lens as to what I need. Students are looking at it through their own lens. Now, we end up in a bit of an ethical pickle in the sense of whose priorities take precedence. So I have funding drivers that I'm responsible for. Academics have research outputs and teaching, and I just want something to make my life better. And students are there to learn. So we have some things that we have to kind of think about in that sense. So they're not, I'll just let you kind of have a look at that, but it really, the demographics one, they were very clear, do not use it for profiling me. But it does depend. So there was a lot of, well, it depends on what you're going to do with it. So it's very clear that it's the messaging and how we think about that. There was an interesting, and I said that there was one international piece with international students. The one about students at risk of failing and who might contact them, if anybody was contacting them, there was a different kind of response there with our international students. They felt that they might lose face in that context, and particularly if it was the academic that was contacting them. They said, I'd much rather have it be a professional staff member because then I'm not losing face with the academic. But then our domestic students said, no, it needs to be the academic because that's who I've got a relationship with. So it was just an interesting little piece that came up. In terms of potential applications, again, comparison between the two, a lot of depends. Students were really clear about they didn't want it being used for educational research. Now, I think that that's a challenging piece because for all of us, clearly, but it's thinking about and the messaging and how we position that, I think, is really critical, because what they were thinking, it was about, they weren't necessarily, when we asked them about curriculum improvement or that kind of thing, they weren't uncomfortable with that. So they were tying it to a much more personal side of life. And in terms of the concerns, so again, transparency and about how it's being used was on the academic side. Profiling, academics quite clearly said profiling. Our students didn't until we followed up with them. So part of it, their concern levels that were sitting around those other things had to do with profiling. So profiling was kind of underpinning it. Everybody's worried about third parties and consent to data. That provides us with some really interesting challenges, I think, in terms of educational technology and how we move into that. I get a lot of push in my area around using publishers and publisher different things. I'm not all that comfortable with that on a number of levels, and some of that is about data, but some of it's also about outsourcing our educational business. It's a whole other conversation. So basically, I just want to wind up because I know that problem will be waving at me madly in a minute. So just thinking about some of those challenges that we have in terms of our development, how do we prioritize our work? So when we think about this, and I will drive it from my point of view, again, coming back to what I said earlier, Flinders is based on student success. To me, it's a student thing. It is student data that we're largely using, and I think that we need to be respectful of that. We have to think about that, and I guess one of my sayings is just because we can doesn't mean we should. Let's think carefully about what it is that we're doing, and not being paternalistic in that sense, being very clear with students what it is that we're doing, why we're doing it, how it might be helpful to them. I think that our other challenge in this is the kind of uses that students think would be helpful to them requires engagement from our academics, and that's really challenging in different areas. So how do we get that? Even the fact of students academics want to do things uniquely, but in order to get this, we need consistency in some of our systems. So that's a challenge. We also need the academics to provide us with a reasonable amount of guidance in that. So one of the things is, how do we navigate our way through this? And I'm thinking, our challenges are also our solutions, in the sense that the key to engaging both academics and students in this process is to proceed with a really transparent and ethical frame of reference, rather than our own enthusiasm or our business intentions. So my suggestion for doing that is, ensuring that reports are fit for context of teaching, thinking about that in relation to pedagogy, education, discipline. How do we position that? Make it explicit about what we're actually doing, why we're doing it, and how we're doing it. Thinking about that in relation to how the report can be useful at different points in time in different roles. Continuing to remind students that we're collecting this data and we're using it, and how we're using it, and for what purpose, what the benefit can be for them. I think we need to highlight the drawbacks of that for them as well. So we can't just present this entirely rosy picture. I think that we need to, lots of conversation needs to kind of happen around some of this stuff. I think our conversation around the educational piece and the ethical piece has to keep pace, or at least try to keep pace with the technical developments, because we're getting outstripped really rather quickly, and that is concerning. It's centers like this. So Flinders has a research center that is named after the former U.S. ambassador to Australia, the Honorable Jeff Bleich. So he, in fact, has had a very strong focus on how technology can impact on governance and civil society. And it's one of those areas that we actually are doing a lot of work in. More recently, we've gotten into the education space, partially because of my engagement with the Jeff Bleich Center. So we're really trying to push that argument forward, and we're starting to get a little bit of traction there with people like the Department of Education, which I think is really exciting. So I think more of that needs to happen, and it needs to happen in a really robust kind of way. There's a bunch of references at the back that I've referred to, so when you have that, you can follow any of those up if you'd like to. I just made it, did I? So happy to take any.
Yeah, we have time for questions.
Hello there. So you talked a lot about gathering the data and the interplay between the educational side and the IT side. It seems like there will be a fairly complex data gathering process before we ever even can do any analysis. Could you talk about how in the real world the data is gathered?
The data, sorry, do you mean the data that we're collecting already around the systems and that for use in analytics?
Correct,
Yeah. I mean, we're all collecting it, right? I mean, it's automatic in the systems. How we're doing that is the variation, I think, in the sense of, and that's my link back to, depends on how we're using the educational technology. If we're doing, some institutions are more robust in that sense and are more structured, and so we have data that's more usable. Having those conversations with academics can be particularly challenging. Then how do we translate that? So we did actually have, my previous institutions were collecting that, we were having conversations, we were presenting the data and the application of that and it being used. Sadly, it wasn't being used to the extent that I would have liked it to have been used. And which led us to doing some more work about how do we kind of engage that. Now, in places like Malaysia, because they have less use of the learning management system, then of course there's less data being collected. And that kind of goes back to our, how do you position this, and different institutions being at different levels of sophistication around that. If you're not using those systems, we can't get that data. It's as simple as that.
The issue though, Deb, is more, right? Is it more, and you had that in the latest survey, that the data is being collected in many cases, as you said, but it's not being used. So there's, in many cases, large enterprise data warehouses that are being created that are just, repositories that the data is going into, as a just in case, or maybe in the future, or when we hire the data scientists, right? And that, it seems like that is happening a lot in Australia and I think in the US, but that's also one of the things students express concern about.
Yeah.
Don't be collecting and sitting on my data, just because maybe in the future. I don't want you to have that if there's not something being done for me. So I think it's the questions around, it's stored and getting ready to use, and it's actually getting into a format to where I think folks like us can, folks with ACT and developing solutions can begin to do important things to solve these problems.
Absolutely. And there is this whole dialogue about, we'll collect it just in case we're going to use it. And also because data is valuable, so therefore, of course, we need to keep it. So there is kind of that dialogue going on as well, but in many places it's not being used, or certainly not used for the benefit of students. That's the other piece that I would say. At most of the focus when we did the institutional stuff, most of the focus was on institutional, what you might better refer to as business analytics. So that was where institutions were putting their focus. So in that sense of using it.
Do you feel like academics are sufficiently data literate?
Completely depends on the discipline. Yeah, so we see some phenomenal work, learning analytics work going on in the computer science departments because they're really passionate about doing this stuff and building algorithms, and they do, but they do tend to just do it with their own class. So there's that. You go through to we were having a conversation about earlier this morning about languages areas. And so in that sense, it's different types of data than they're used to. And I think it's an important point to make because I get into some of this stuff because, you know, my background is more social sciences. And, you know, people talk about the kind of hard data and soft, and for God's sake, we come at it from different research approaches, and one is not better than the other. If you want to kind of think about some of that, like the natural language processing, social network analysis, that's the stuff that'll get the languages people really excited. It's not going to get the physics people very excited. So again, it's contextual. And I think, but we still absolutely need to give people the data in the simplest form, in a readable form. There'll be a piece of that of people wouldn't have the skills to investigate it. Secondly, they don't have the time nor inclination. So the really keen people say, I want to be able to go in and play with that data set, and I want to be able to understand it, and I want to be able to test it. I want to make sure these people have done it properly. That's like 5% of the academics. You know, if they really understand that stuff, they'd much rather apply that to their research outputs as opposed to looking at it for their teaching. Again, very small proportion. And then you've got the people who aren't going to understand it anyway, because that's not their expertise, field of expertise. And it's a different kind of data. So I think it ranges. I don't think they necessarily have the time or the inclination. They have other things to spend their precious time on. And just because it's our passion and priority doesn't mean that it's theirs. Yeah, I think give it to people as simply as possible. But that just holds true of everything in life, right? Yeah.
It's challenging in my mind that gets hard because I see many things that they call themselves analytic solutions, and they're not. They're just like a simple visualization, and the kind of work that we would do to create a visualization with something really powerful behind it gets ignored and doesn't get seen in the market and people buying stuff. I mean, I talked to one tech company that was creating a dropout indicator, and I talked to the founder, and she said, you know, I tell you what this is based on, but it really comes from 20 years of my classroom experience maintaining an Excel spreadsheet. And I found the right algorithm. I found the answer, right? And I mean, she was literally like creating this out of like a weighted formula in a spreadsheet, and nothing against weighted formulas, but like, I don't know that was the most robust approach to solving that problem. So I think there is a tension between rigor and I think the kind of rigorous work we can do and presenting things in ways that people will be able to use and digest, but also appreciate the more sophisticated work that should be done to make sure just because it's pretty doesn't mean, or it's elegant and easy to understand, right? It doesn't mean it's right. And I think I see that as a tension that's really difficult to navigate when talking with prospective customers and asking those questions in the market.
And I think there's also another piece to that in my mind that, you know, these kinds of data reports and the information that are provided, I put my level of trust in the experts to build the algorithms. I can't build them. You know, like that's your forte, that's not mine. So I have to have a level of trust in that, but it also it has to be done ethically because there's a sense of, there's a lot of stuff going on in the black box that I don't understand. So I need to be able to trust that, and I have to build that. But the next piece of it is, it's only a piece of information for having a conversation and a dialogue. It's not the machine making the decision for me. So it's actually, this is the best information that you can give me based on those algorithms within my institution in a trusted environment that I've I trust the institution has chosen these particular reports because of the robustness that's sitting behind them. And if I need to get somebody to explain it, I can bring in the data scientist to explain it. But at the same time, it's giving you a piece of information as an academic to open a conversation to improve the learning. I mean, I think it's far more nuanced, and we have to be more nuanced about how we explain things and the language that we use around that.
Any other questions?
So there's this idea that, you know, we're in this arms race with artificial intelligence in general, but, you know, even if we just kind of keep it narrowly around AI and learning, governments in countries like China and Russia have magnitudes of data much, much more greater than UK or US or Australian kinds of educational institutions. Some of that's cultural, some of it's governmental. And on the one hand, I love the idea that, you know, a lot of these Western democracies are getting better at data literacy and privacy and respecting and the ethics and all of the things that we're doing well to execute on that. But it sort of applies brakes, as we've seen throughout ed tech industries where, you know, whole initiatives are shut down in the interest of privacy and ethics. And again, that's not to discount the importance of doing those things, but it also means that, again, countries like China and Russia can continue to gather the data-hungry feeds that they need to enable new machine learning, new AI techniques and abilities. So what do you think about this tension between we're doing the right things, but ultimately we're trading off for maybe competitiveness in a global marketplace on how that works?
Mm. It is a tension. It's an absolute tension. But I think it's from our point of view, from my point of view, I think it's a necessary trade-off. I think that there's lots of things that we can do to get competitive advantage, but are they the right things? And I mean, at the end of the day, I kind of come back to a civil society, a governance viewpoint. I'm a social worker by training. I can't go without the social justice piece. So that whole business outweighs the social and ethical right thing to do. I also think that we need to think about, ethics is more nuanced than it often gets talked about, and understanding ethical theory and different ways of ethical decision making, I think, is a key part of that. I do think that we don't need to necessarily consume those products that are developed and take, I've heard of some quite disturbing things in other countries that people, I do a lot of international review and people submit journal articles and sometimes they're just hair raising in what they're saying. And we don't need to accept that. We don't need to apply that. We don't need to deal with companies that work like that. So I think we have a choice in there. It's not an easy one because I think everybody's kind of driven by, I need to be financially viable, I need to do all of that. But at the end of the day, I just think as people, if we're not going to be the barrier to that happening, they're certainly not going to be.
Any questions online? Yeah.
Reminder, there's a reception and the co-lab after this at 1. So if you're in the office, those on the phone and in the room, please stop by and have a cookie and a drink.
Yeah.
Cookies, drink.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you all. On the behalf of ACT, ACT Next, and organizing committee of ACT Tech Talks, we are thankful to Deb for coming here all the way from Australia and delivering very engaging and inspiring talk. At the same time, we want to thank John for inviting Deb as well as introducing Deb for this wonderful talk, as well as thanks to all of you for your continuous presence, asking very interesting questions. Thanks to our Zoom participant, as well as our ACT Next team, Andrew, Adam, Matt, Toby, Drake, Deborah Glass, and Eric for their support. As we invite speakers from inside ACT, as well as there are the speakers who also do work in the some interesting area which are important for our ACT Next vision sense goal. So in that directions, our next talk will held on December 11 by Amanda Nevlin. She is Vice President Learning Architecture as well as Head of US Learning Design Studio at Smart Sparrow. So she will deliver talk on designing for innovation in education. So one small thing, as there is another event going on during same time on December 11. So venue will be different. It will be Linguistic Building, LD 115. But still, even the venue is different, but we look for your presence for this interesting talk. At the same time, this will be the last talk for the year 2019 for this ACT Tech Talk series. So thanks again for your presence. Thank you.